Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me on my podcast, Black Women North of 50. My name is Wynn. I am a licensed psychotherapist and your host. Today, we're going to be talking about sex and sexuality, how it's a very challenging topic to discuss that we don't talk about very much because we don't get taught to talk about it. So as we grow older and older, we don't recognize that we can receive as well as give pleasure sexually. How many times have you talked to your partner about how your sex life is, the things that you want, need, and are not getting? And you are getting all the good and the bad. It doesn't happen a lot. I've got a guest today that is an expert in talking about sex and sexuality, and we're going to explore some of the issues of pleasure, pleasure centers, intimacy, and we're going to have a demonstration. Okay, with props. Stay with me, and thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited, and I mean that literally. I'm going to be talking with Jeshana Johnson. That's Dr. Jeshana Johnson, who is a doctor of psychology here in Los Angeles. She does a radio show, which I'm going to ask her to talk about in a little bit. And I'm really excited to have you here. Thank you.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
You have done so much work with sexuality, sex, women, how we respond to things. I'm very impressed because I saw you first at an event and I was very taken by how comfortable you were talking about women's bodies and how we don't know anything about them and all of that. Part of what I want to do today is talk about women's bodies and sexuality and where we get hung up in it, particularly as we get older. My audience is over 50 for the most part, and it changes, the body changes. Tell me a little bit about what changes in a woman's body and how we respond to sex over 50.
Well, there are so many, I'm sure we all know. I'll actually be 50 in a few days on the 29th. So,
Happy birthday early.
thank you. First of all, the bodies that we learn about sex and sexuality in are not the bodies that most of us keep. Those are the bodies that are young and flexible and, full of great hormones. And then as we get older, those things start to decrease, like our estrogen decreases, our, our testosterone decreases, like all of those things. Our bodies don't necessarily move like they used to do before. And so it's important for us to also change our mindset about who we are as sensual and sexual beings as we get older. So, part of the things that can happen is as we get older, because estrogen starts to drop at the age of 30, that's when it can begin to start. So by the time we are 50, we've lost a lot of estrogen, and that can impact like vaginal dryness, painful sex, things like that. So we have to go about it in a different way, like use some things that are helpful. And so those are how our bodies changes. Our boobs are not as perky as they used to be, but I don't think they sag, they relax, right?
Yeah.
And so those are all kinds. There are some things about our bodies. We gain weight, we lose weight. Like, yeah, those things are the things that really changes for our bodies.
Tell me about your beginnings in terms of being interested in sex and sexuality. You do a lot of things, and trauma is one of them. What's the intersection between sex and trauma for women?
Well, here's what I will say. I think how we show up in our bedrooms is usually how we show up in the world. And because most of us have some kind of trauma in our life, that also impacts the lens in how we see ourselves and how we show up in the world. And when I began this work, I was not someone who was like really heavily trauma focused. As a matter of fact, I used to be a department chair. I've been a professor at a school, a director of clinical training, and I taught almost every single class except research and trauma. And those are the two I stayed away from. Well, full circle, dealing with people's sex lives, dealing with how they see themselves, their sense of self, and how that shows up in the bedroom usually relates to their own traumas, whether that's a big T trauma or a little T trauma. And so I was like, wait a minute. People aren't just coming in and asking, how do I get my intimacy back? There are some things that are in the way that barriers to them
Mhm.
leaning into their intimacy, sexuality, and sensuality.
Right. I don't know. I mean, I think about how I want to keep the lights off. Part of it is
Yes,
because
yes,
part of it is, like were saying, about body changing and
yep.
feeling
Body image, how you see yourself.
right. And am I going to be enough kind of thing? What is the role? I know that we've talked about how you grew up in a Christian environment,
Yes.
and we talked a little bit about how shame plays into women and sex, whether you were raised in a Christian environment or not. Talk to me a little bit about how shame gets in the way.
Yeah. So I was raised in a Christian home. I'm very grateful for my roots. I don't put that on the shelf at all. It is part of who I am. I embrace my spirituality and my religion. And I also understand the intent of the church, particularly in my experience, and a lot of the experiences that I deal with, is that people come in and they have been told, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And sex is never something that it's good. It's pleasurable. It's always don't do it. It is fear based. You're going to
Mhm.
get pregnant. You're going to get an STI or FTD, those kind of things. And we end up, psychologically pairing sex with no, don't do it. It's bad. Right. And then when we're supposed to get to be able to do it because you're now married, that switch doesn't just turn on that like, oh, I'm married and now I can do this. It's been paired for so long. Don't do this. That's, you know, um, that you save that for marriage. But what am I saving for marriage? How is it pleasurable? You don't necessarily see parents being intimate. And so you see kids growing up, they're not affectionate, seeing parents affectionate. And so they're like, oh, well, if my hormones are raging now when I'm young, and this is my peak opportunity, but I'm supposed to save it till I'm married, but I'm looking at my married parents who aren't affectionate at all. Like, what am I waiting for? So there's a lot of confusion around that, right? I know I didn't go through the purity culture, but I had some cousins who went through purity culture, and it was, they had the ceremony, and I remember seeing this and wanting that. Like, I wanted to have that ceremony. I didn't marry as a virgin. There was some shame around that because I felt like I had let God down. I felt like I had let my parents down. I felt like I had let my church down. And that shame that just kind of came with that. And what we know about shame is that shame makes you go in hiding. It makes you feel bad about yourself. Guilty is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And that has a direct impact on our sense of self, how we see ourselves. We're no longer seeing ourselves as how God sees ourselves. We see ourselves through the lens that I'm a bad person and I'm not good enough, right?
Yeah.
But some of the training in the purity culture was using analogies like, you know, y- right now you're a nice piece of gum, and if you have sex before marriage, you're like gum that has been chewed. Who would want that?
Oh,
So
good heavens.
so a lot of times purity culture really tied your worth to whether or not you maintained your virginity, right? And we know that most people don't keep their sex before marriage. They mostly have sex before marriage, so they go into a marriage feeling guilty. They go into a marriage feeling shame because they didn't wait.
And
this church
if they don't have, if you don't have a partner who is willing to, whatever his experience is.
Exactly. And so if you go into a marriage feeling like that, you already come into your bedroom with barriers to being the free, sensual, and sexual being God designed you to be.
Yeah. And communication, such a huge issue. If your partner, I don't even want to start there. If you are not raised to have communication, the words and the verbiage about how to see yourself, your body, how it functions, then how are you supposed to talk about it when you get older?
Right.
I have a theory about masturbation I want to run off if you can tell me.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
I think that, well, okay, there are a lot of reasons why masturbation for women is taboo. I think one of them is because we never get taught about our bodies and our pleasure centers.
Yes.
You think that's part of it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Most women that come into my office and have struggled with orgasmic disorder, their ability to have an orgasm, when I ask them, have they masturbated? The majority of the time they say no. So they don't know what is needed for their body to reach that. And they're depending on a partner to figure that out. But if you don't know what turns you on and how to get yourself there, right? As well as your relationship with yourself, then how is someone else really going to know that for you? You can't even direct someone because you haven't learned about yourself, right? And I know that sometimes, like masturbation is a big taboo thing to really talk about. And given that as a professor, when I'm teaching in all um, in a classroom with all walks of life, right? My desire to talk about it freely in a classroom has become, my students have stretched me, right? My students have stretched me regarding being able to talk freely about masturbation, because I also came into my marriage with shame and guilt around masturbation. As a sex therapist, I use masturbation as a tool for people to develop a relationship with themselves. You know how many women have had other people get more pleasure from their bodies than they have themselves, right? And so helping them, and I never have people violate their own erotic and intimate integrity. But we do talk about what masturbation means for them. We do talk about the shame and the guilt that can be attached to that. And then we talk about what it means to know thyself, to know thy body that God gave you, right? He gave you this amazing body. Why would you not know it? We have no problems knowing how our fingers work. We have no problems knowing how our toes work. We have no problem massaging our legs when they're hurting and it feels good. We just tend to have the issue with the pleasure that comes from rubbing the parts of us that we have been told, no, don't touch.
Yeah. And I'm guessing there are a lot of people who never got taught this from their mothers because their mothers never taught them.
Yeah.
In a generation where it's just like, okay, go with the flow.
Yeah. And a lot of times we learn, and that's another thing. So not only do we learn from like church, community, and family that no, don't do it. But if you do it, you're doing it in secret, you're doing it fast, and there's shame that, like, so all of this pairing around sex and sexuality and intimacy gets paired with negative things. And then we wonder, like, why we're struggling in the marriage because of all of this socialization.
And those shame issues don't necessarily go away.
Not until you process them and work through them. No, they show up.
Mm-hmm. In maybe more subtle ways, or you just get
Yeah.
more comfortable and have more
Yeah.
habits in terms of your sexuality. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I was teaching last night, and of course, I love to bring my teaching aids.
Oh,
So,
goodness.
right.
Thank you. Bring her out.
I don't even know if you noticed. Do you notice the one that's
Oh,
here?
goodness. No. Nice.
But yeah, so I was teaching and I was naming these parts, like
Let's do.
inner. Yeah. So our outer labia, our inner labia, because we don't call it labia majora, which meant big, and labia minora, which meant little, because not everybody's body is the same. And so our vulvas, not a vagina, right? Our vulvas are all different. And so sometimes our outer lips are bigger and sometimes our inner lips are bigger. And so we have done away with labia majora, labia minora. The words are kind of like antiquated, but we say outer lips, inner lips, clitoral hood, clitoris, and most people don't know what the clitoris look like. I always tell them, this is what your clitoris looks like, right? And then, of course, I have the big version, right? The big version. And that all of this is touch sensitive and it carries 10,281 nerves. So, particularly when I'm talking to Christian women and Christian men, I talk about, like, you believe God created you. But when he created you, he also gave you this, and this has no other function but pleasure. So my God is a God of pleasure, and he wanted you to enjoy it. So let's not,
Don't get it twisted.
exactly, let's not, use what he designed for us to have pleasure.
Yes, I wonder people's reaction when you show them a vulva in your class. Have they ever?
Yeah.
A lot of people have never seen it before. Is that right? They have never.
They haven't. And then I even talk about how all of this is touch sensitive, but inside the vaginal canal, that's where the vagina is not touch sensitive. It's pressure sensitive. And so when women who say, I've never had a vaginal orgasm, I talk about how, yeah, then you're in the majority, because most women do not have a vaginal orgasm. And if we look at it, this is how, it lays behind the walls. So even when there's penetration, there's still touch to the clitoris. So the clitoris is involved for our pleasure. So whether that's touching it, poking it, licking it, breathing on it, all of that pleasure it has to involve the clitoris. Now there are plenty of women who get a lot of pleasure from penetrative sex. And they enjoy that feeling, that pressure feeling. But that's not the majority of women. So we also have to unlearn and relearn what sex looks like and not just put it in a box that penetrative sex, penis and vagina, is the only type of sex that exists.
Right. The notion that I'm doing this to please him.
Yes.
And it's like I'm a vessel of some kind, and that's kind of it. What do you think about women who they've taught themselves to fake it? How is it possible to get past that?
They a lot. So there's a couple of things that are happening when there's faking. What I have found is that people don't have the language to talk about it. They don't have the solid sense of self to be able to bring it up, meaning knowing who you are, knowing what you deserve, knowing your desires, and being able to voice that without feeling guilt or shame about asking for your needs to be met. The other thing is that they may think that their partner's ego is too weak or too fragile. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Talking about these things are super important. And it's also a growing up process.
Hmm.
I often talk about how it's so important to understand that relationships are about growing up. And talking about your sex life is about growing up. It's about being able to tolerate the discomfort for growth. We grow in the discomfort zone. Nothing grows in the comfort zone. So a lot of times when I'm asking couples about their sex life, like tell me about your last intimate moment, and they're walking me through it. And I'm like, wait, stop, stop. What were you thinking when that happened? And you begin to get into the thoughts and the feelings and the beliefs and the shame and the guilt, and the suppression and the depression, like all of those things that are tied to just how your partner initiated sex, just how they touched you, and we began to unravel that. It's not a matter of just talk about sex and you'll have the better sex, or just have sex and you'll want more sex. It's about the meaning making that we attach to what we're doing and who we're doing it with.
Right. You have a love blueprint.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So the love blueprint really goes through our past. It takes us back to our first love, which is our caregivers, how we learn to love and how we learn to receive love, how we learn to fight, and how we learn to recover. And 100% of the time, how we learned it is how it shows up. And there's, Esther Perel, who I love, she talks about tell me how you make love, and I'll show you how you were loved.
Mm.
And that's so true. If you have a hard time receiving love, it's going to show up in your relationship. Some of us are very good at giving it. Some of us have a hard time receiving it. And it's
Yes.
really tied to our self-worth, right? And so we began to look at like childhood frustrations and how you responded to that, childhood needs and how you responded to that, and then what that looks like in your relationship as an adult and how it also shows up in your bedroom. And so couples are like blown away when they do this work with their like childhood stuff, and then they put it into this narrative, and now they read it and they're like, oh wait, I'm talking about my partner. I'm talking about what I'm needing from my partner now, based off of what they got from their childhood. And as
Mhm.
much as we like to say, I'm going to do the very opposite, if we didn't have a great, how do you do the opposite when you haven't had the ability to
A
practice
guideline,
that?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And keeping those going on with what you're saying, you get to be 50 plus and you have all of these ingrained thoughts
Yeah.
and feelings and stop growing, like you were
Yeah.
saying, stop
Yeah.
learning.
Yeah. And
Also,
I try not to like pathologize it. I call it like patterns of survival.
mm,
And you get 50 and you start realizing I've been doing this all my life. I ask my clients, tell me about a time when you didn't show up like that. And they can't pinpoint it because they've been doing it for so long. So let's thank your body and your mind for showing up in the way that it needed to. But ask yourself if that's how you still want to show up.
right. Let's move into the future about,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking, particularly Black women over 50 have been giving, and I'm going global here, giving their whole life,
Overgiving,
over
right? We
giving.
call that over functioning.
Mm,
And
that,
when you are an overfunctioner, because I am a recovering overfunctioner, when you are an overfunctioner, you're usually with the partner who will underfunction so you can overfunction.
mm, yeah, this
Somehow
is,
they understand that need for you to overfunction. So they sit that
back.
also means that we have to stop overfunctioning. I get
Yes.
women all the time like, how do I get my partner to start functioning more? I say you got to stop overfunction. But if I don't overfunction, then things are going to fall through the cracks. Yeah, that's the learning curve. Imagine how that overfunctioning, expending that much energy, robs you from the ability to relax, and it's going to take you out of your desire to want to have sex. You're tired.
It's
You're tired. You've overfunctioned all day. You have felt underhelped. So that is a turn off.
mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I keep thinking about how this is so important to talk about
Yeah.
between the people in a
Yeah.
relationship, just down and dirty, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Um,
Or
about
pun intended.
or pun intended, one or the other. These really basic things that we don't get taught to talk about.
Mhm.
And you get into this intimate relationship and you want to please the other person. You're an overfunctioner, like you're saying, and you forget about yourself because you've
Mhm.
never been taught to think about yourself first.
Mhm.
And that doesn't
Mhm.
mean, pushing the other guy aside and you like, no, I don't want to please you. It's just there are two people here. We've got a pleasure center. I'm going to show you where it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
You offer intimacy seminars.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about those.
And so in these seminars, I do them for a women only audience. I also do them for a men only audience. The men's one is called like the locker room. And I do a couples one as well.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the things are tailored to like teaching women about their bodies and pleasure, teaching men about their bodies and pleasure, and also giving men sex education 101. Because to be honest with you, think about your sex education and where that came from, right? I
Mhm.
remember my sex education. I got it from a PE teacher in the 7th grade at Horseman Junior High School. I am pretty sure my PE teacher was not certified to teach me human sexuality.
Well, look, at
So
least you got into school. I learned from friends.
yeah. And where did they learn from? The majority of us did not learn from church. We did not learn from parents, and we did not learn adequate sex education from our schools. And it hasn't been comprehensive. It's also a scare tactic, right? The schools have also scared us with, I remember seeing pictures of genital herpes and, and it's the severe cases. So they scare you into not wanting it, right? And so again, you ask like when we get married, then and you're supposed to do it, like how are you supposed to do it when you never saw pictures of genital herpes and HIV? Like
I'm
that
not
is
doing that.
a right. I do not want that. So um so I come into these churches, I give particularly men, but women too, right? About sex education so that they understand not only their bodies, but the female bodies. And I also dispel a lot of myths, right? Size, like size matter, but not in the way that most people think, right?
Mm.
It is not this large package that we need. It's not the large package that we need. Although most women who have male partners are very satisfied with their partner's size, most men are not satisfied with their size. And part of that has to do with watching porn and learning that that is the standard, and it is not. When I talk about size, I talk about the average size of a male penis is 5.5 inches. That's the average size. Most men are average. And we also know that penis size is not tied to ethnicity, and it is not tied to shoe size. So you
Just waiting on
cannot
that one.
so you cannot tell the size of male genital parts, right? Of the penis based off of his hand size and his shoe size. But it's these kind of myths and things like that that also build on shame, um, and make people hide, right? And also not make people want to ask questions. Men want to learn. Men want to know. However, because we expect them to know what they're doing, there's shame around asking questions.
And in your seminars for just men,
Yes,
did you
we
find
talk
that there?
about that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
they love it. They talk about it. And I also give them freedom because I tell them they're not responsible for their partner's orgasm. They're responsible for theirs. And their partner is responsible for their orgasm. That means that two people have to come to play, not just one.
That's something that doesn't get taught for sure.
No. Mm-mm.
It's a lot of
Mm-mm. That means
responsibility
you
for
have, yeah. When it's your responsibility, that means you have to take an active role in it.
absolutely. The ones that you do, the groups that you do for men and women, is it couples
Yes.
or just people?
It's couples, but I've also done just people. I've done them for different, I started with KGLH doing them, right? And that's how I was found for KBLA. But I started
Yeah,
off with just,
tell me tell me
yeah.
where your radio show is on and what station.
Okay, yeah, it's on the KBLA 1580 AM. It's talk radio, the only Black owned and operated talk radio show west of the Mississippi, owned by Tavis Smiley, right in the heart of Lamert Park. My show is on Saturdays and from 5 to 7 called Let's Get Intimate with Dr. Jeshana Johnson. And then it rebroadcasts on Sundays from 5 to 7. You can also catch it on any podcast because it is podcast as well. So you can catch it on any podcast platform.
Mm-hmm.
Apple Podcast, Spotify. Yeah. So,
How nice that it's
yeah.
on Sunday too.
Yeah.
So you can combine the spirituality with sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So we have sexy sensual Saturdays and sexy Sundays.
Oh, that's
I teach
great.
at Antioch University and I'm always teaching 3 classes at a time each quarter. I love teaching because I enjoy pouring into the next generation of marriage and family therapists and psychologists. So that's a very good passion of mine. And my seminars are also personal. Like, you know, your group of friends can call me and say, "Hey, we got a group of 20. I come into the home," things like that. One of the seminars that I love is we do a Galentine's event, which
Mhm.
is bedroom techniques. So linking yoga poses with bedroom techniques that increase pleasure. And so it's super fun. It's super relaxing. And the women are like, "Oh my gosh, I never learned this." And really getting in a place of um prioritizing pleasure and not chasing orgasm.
Yes. Yeah, as the ultimate goal. That's
Yeah,
what
yeah,
we learn
yeah, yeah,
from early on. It's like, okay,
yeah,
he's got to come, or
yeah,
I didn't do my
yeah.
job.
When you go into the bedroom with "I need to make him come" or "I didn't do my job," you go in performing. And that's not what sex is about. Sex is about connecting and an experience. So I always say orgasms are like dessert. If you go to a restaurant and you enjoy the ambiance and you enjoy your food and you are responsible for your own order, your partner is responsible for their own order, you may share some food, you are having an experience for yourself while being right there with your partner. They are having an experience with themselves and while being right there with you. And at the end, you may or you may not want dessert because you're full and the food was good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then sometimes you order dessert. So if we think about orgasms in that way, we enter our room, our bedrooms or kitchens or wherever you're doing it, right? We enter with a different mindset that I'm going into this as an experience and it's supposed to be pleasurable. So just like you have dinner and you're sitting now, if you're having dinner and all you do is eating and you're on your phone, then that's probably the kind of sex you're having too. But you can start with increasing and enhancing your pleasure by how you have meals together.
I love a food metaphor. That's great.
Yes.
I'm going to ask if you had any final thoughts. I have appreciated this so much.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just say that prioritize pleasure and play in your sex life, no matter what age, so that as we get older, we have had practice on how to do that, right? And know that our best sex lives come as we get older. I'm definitely having the better sex now at 50 than I was at 20 and 30, right? Because sex and pleasure is very much so tied to our sense of self. Who I am at 50 is much more solid than who I was at 20.
You're trying to figure out who you are at 20.
Yes, and that's hard to relax and play when you're thinking about who am I and who am I doing this with, right?
And what am I wearing? And what's the lighting?
Exactly. And is my stomach this? And do I look good in this way?
My
Right.
better side.
At 50, I'm not faking it. At 50, I'm speaking up for my pleasure. At 50, I'm telling you, no, that ain't it. This is it. And so prioritizing our pleasure and looking forward to having the better sex as we emotionally, mentally, and physically mature is important.
Thank you so much for being so open about all of this. I mean, that's a part of it, and you do it beautifully. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.